So let's talk about getting an army together to please the dark gods of Warhammer 40k, with a guide to how to start Chaos Space Marines, why you want to collect the faction, all the options for first miniature purchases and expanding the army, and much more. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos, and in this video I thought it was high time for an update for my How to Start Chaos Space Marines video for 10th edition, with an in-depth look at starting the faction from a new player's perspective. I think it's one of the armies in 40k where there's more going on with them than virtually almost any other faction, and in this video we'll talk about why you might want to start collecting Chaos Marines with a look at a few of the models along the way, the other places that you can learn about the faction and planning an army, including the options for paint schemes and legion choice, talking about acquiring the rules and all the ideas for first purchase of miniatures that you might want to go down, expanding the army with currently good stuff in game should you wish to, and options for dipping into Heresy type ranges, and then a little bit about gameplay and one example strong 2000 point list right now. Absolutely loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect Chaos Space Marines in the first place? The Chaos Space Marines are basically the elite super soldier Space Marines fallen to the ruinous powers most of the time a long time ago in the Horus Heresy, and with the blessings of the Dark Gods come great unnatural abilities, possess Marines, demon weapons, and all manner of unnatural corruption, though such benefits often come at a great cost. They wage their internal war against the Imperium, most legions and warbands eventually wanting the overthrow of the Corpse Emperor and the destruction of the Imperium as a whole, and they can make war with most of the armory that's accessible to the Space Marines, at least of the more firstborn variety, backed up by demon engines, unnatural sorcery, and demonic allies. Miniatures wise in 40k, Chaos Space Marines I think now have really quite a nice range as they go. Games Workshop have been updating the miniatures bit by bit over the past 5 years or so. Classics like Havoc, Standard Chaos Marines, Terminators and Possessed all being redone, and I think that the core of the range really holds up quite nicely. There are still some older relics amongst it. The Chaos Bikers need an update, there are rumours to have one coming with the next Chaos Codex. Noise Marines are very dated, and there are a few older tanks and vehicles like say the Trusty Defiler. I would say that they're not an army that's overflowing with older models that don't hold up. They can also dip into the Heresy range to some extent, various patterns of armour, plus potentially some Forge World individual Legion sculpted things, though that comes at a bit of a cost. Perhaps more than most armies in 40k, if you go down that kind of route you could be winding up with a force that looks very different indeed. Pricing wise I'd say they're kind of medium in Warhammer 40k. They are fairly elite, though not quite as many deals as the Space Marines get usually with all of their combat patrols. There's definitely more expensive armies to collect out there though. For some examples for some of their miniatures, in the top left here we have the Chaos Space Marine Legionaries, the core troops of the army, and basically the equivalent of tactical squads either of the Heresy or of the Loyalists. We've got Abaddon the Despoiler here, really quite a nice miniature I think, festooned in spikes and trophy racks, and on the top right we've got one of the slightly lesser demon engines with the Venom Crawler, a great spider engine-like thing that boosts the power of nearby sorcerers. Chaos Marines are often accompanied into battle by a ragtag bunch of followers and hangers-on. Here are some cultists armed with a flamethrower on the top left. There's a great hulking Vindicator tank on the top right here with its siege-busting Demolisher cannon, one of the unit options that's shared with the Loyalists, a possessed Warp Talon with a jump pack hurtling towards the enemy in the centre here, and on the bottom right a mighty Demon Prince, a Chaos Lord ascended to the ruinous powers once and for all. In game at the moment, Chaos Space Marines I think are quite fun. Their current rules are downloadable from Warhammer Community, and the way that they play right now is centered around their Dark Packs, having to take a leadership test for fear of taking some mortal wounds, but in exchange for that risk they get some big damage buffs, things like lethal hits and sustained hits to make their units a lot scarier, and a lot of their army tends to focus around big units with layers wombo combo type buffs. Say you could have a unit that's getting benefits both from a character attached to their squad, plus the Chaos Mark and the Dark Pack that they make, plus maybe a stratagem. In general, compared with the Loyalists, they tend to maybe be a little bit more melee focused over range, though currently in the rules their ranged units are quite strong with things like Obliterators and Forge Fiends, and at least at time of recording they are very strong just in Warhammer 40k in general, definitely towards the top end of the power spectrum with their strongest lists, though I'd say they're not a faction where every single list is super powerful. They can be toned down very easily if you're running a more mix of units. If you do choose to play Chaos Space Marines, then there's loads of places that you can go to learn a bit more about them. I would bear in mind that if you're getting started, the core Codex Chaos Space Marines does govern the more standard legions and warbands, things like Black Legion, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Emperor's Children, and Word Bearers thematically. 3 of the 4 more deity-specific ones Death Guard, Thousand Sons and World Eaters all have their own armies, small miniature ranges, and their separate rules. But in general, I'd say that none of those are quite as well supported as the main Chaos Space Marine range, at least miniatures wise. There are plenty of Chaos Space Marine options that the standard Chaos can get, but none of those can use. If you're looking to learn a little bit more about Chaos, there's loads of places that you can go. Index Chaos Space Marines might be a good start just to have a read through their unit rules and data sheets to see what's on offer. If you want to mess around with other rules, there's Battlescribe and Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app for full rules and army list creation. You could proxy some models with Tabletop Simulator, trying some things out in game before you buy, or just proxy it with other miniatures that you might have in your collection. And it's not hard to find far more content on YouTube as well. I've made a few Chaos Space Marine videos recently, including a tier list for 10th edition and a general index overview. Feel free to give those a look if you want to check out their rules, but there's tons of battle reports, painting guides, and lore in abundance on other channels. There really is a lot out there if you just bang Chaos Space Marines into YouTube search. Finally, if you do want to ask just a few basic questions, definitely check out General Chaos Space Marine social media. There's Discord channels, Facebook groups, and subreddits for them. It's just nice to keep tabs on those to see what other people are doing, getting some painting inspiration, or just general chat about the faction. You can learn an awful lot from those places. When you're planning out an army, you can definitely just jump in with a box set or two, and then see how it goes from there. A lot of people might find it at least useful at some point though to plan out say a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point list that they're initially going to aim for. That could give you a reasonable idea of what your completed force might eventually look like. With Chaos Space Marines, I think there's quite a lot of options for different ways that you could go about building them. You could build them heavily themed around one certain legion's lore, say for example go word bearers and fill loads and loads of possessed and accursed cultists and all sorts of mutated folks, or go Iron Warriors and make heavy use of heavy mechanized vehicles and big guns. You could also theme a warband around one certain god's mark, say just arbitrarily you're going to only use the mark of Tzeentch for your entire army, dedicated to the Changer of Ways. Could be another fun option for theming. Alternatively, you could play a bit more for gameplay, either just try and collect say somewhat optimized lists for competitive play, or decide that you're going down one certain playstyle of Chaos Space Marines. Say for example you're going to have a very ranged army with a bunch of obliterators and havocs and things. Again, that would fit in pretty well for Iron Warriors maybe. Or decide that you're going to please Khorne and mainly have a focus on savage melee units, charging up the board and ripping the enemy to shreds. For lore and theming, here are the 6 major Chaos Space Marine legions that the Codex Chaos Space Marines generally tends to represent. On the left here we have Iron Warriors, the Siege Warfare, and a heavy tank and demon engine sort of specialists. Black Legion, Abaddon's core Black Crusaders, generally being fairly adaptable and practical for the best ways to overcome the Imperium. There's the Sneaky Alpha Legion with their guerrilla warfare type tactics, the Emperor's Children with their prideful dedication to Slaanesh, the last god-specific legion that doesn't have its own supplement book yet. I guess they will get one at some stage. The Zealous Prophets are the Word Bearers, lots of demonkin amongst their ranks, and Dark Apostles to evangelize the Dark Gods to the non-believers, and the spooky psycho murderers of the Night Lords, often enjoying jumping out of the shadows on jump packs with raptors and things to kill a bunch of the enemy and scare most of the rest of them to death. In 10th edition 40k, game rules aren't tied to any one legion's paint scheme. At time of recording before the Codex, basically most Chaos forces operate in a similar sort of way as a more core army rules type level, and the gameplay is more decided by which units you choose to take. This will change when the Codex is out, though it is kind of nice and freeing, meaning that you can just collect any army and paint it in whatever paint scheme you like, and not have that tied to the game rules and be locked into one thing or another arbitrarily. You definitely don't have to go for one of the core legions though. Lots of renegade warbands also exist out there in the galaxy. Say Huron Blackheart's Red Corsairs or Fabius Bile's Creations of Bile, often themed around one particularly strong character or another, and you can absolutely come up with your own lore or take one from a minor Chaos Space Marine faction out there. Coming up with your own lore background and headcanon is absolutely some of the best fun of 40k. You could pick one of these paint schemes or come up with your own, but then I'd probably start by painting up a test model of some sort. Probably just for being a fairly standard model, I'd likely go for something like a standard Chaos Space Marine Legionary as a good place to start an army. A relatively straightforward model that has a lot of features that are present on plenty of the other models in the faction, so it's a good place to start with working out a paint scheme. I totally recommend looking at YouTube painting tutorials for a way just to get some inspiration as to how other people do them. Even if you're not using the exact same colours, can give you a good idea as to how it's good to get some paint efficiently onto your miniature and make them look really nice. Perhaps one thing that Chaos Space Marines on the painting table are notorious for is the sheer amount of trim for the army though. A lot of legions like to have their core armor plates one colour and then all of the edging and highlights around into another colour, maybe a metallic one most often going for brass, silver or gold. For a few of the models out there, there's so much of that stuff, like with this Helldrake, that it's probably better just spraying the model in the trim colour and then actually going in and painting in the individual armour plates, which is very much the opposite way around to most armies work in 40k. But as you can see with this Helldrake, there is basically more goldy brass than there is black on this Black Legion model. If you're getting an army together to play games in 40k, you need both the rules and the miniatures. The rules for Index Chaos Space Marines are freely downloadable from Warhammer Community at the moment. You found them under the download section and then the Warhammer 40k section of that, though you can also use other sources like Warhapedia and Battlescribe and Games Workshop's official 40k app. Those ones all work as well for rules plus points. If you want some more tactile hard copies, you could perhaps find some of the index cards for Chaos Space Marines. It looks like at least the English language ones are still available plenty of places. These are quite nice, I think, to have on the table just to have unit sheets ready to reference when you need to check a stat or something. Not too expensive as Games Workshop's rules go. I might be tempted to pick one up if I was starting the faction and I didn't know their rules that well. These will basically be valid until spring 2024 when the Codex comes out. Otherwise, for things to read in the meantime, you could think about picking up a past codex if you just wanted something hard copy for a rough look at their lore. Sometimes you can get older copies of Codex Chaos Space Marines going really quite cheap on eBay. Might not be the worst just to have a general feel of the faction, even if the rules contained with it won't be current. Then Codex Chaos Space Marines will be coming out spring 2024. Games Workshop have officially confirmed that. We don't know when in that time frame it might be. But it does basically mean that they're not waiting until the very end of 10th edition, as they were waiting quite a long time in 9th for their update. The codex will likely change things quite a lot. A few unit stats and special rules are likely to alter, but the main thing that it'll add will be a whole bunch of different attachments, so different ways to play the army. I strongly suspect that we'll have themed attachments based around the different legions, kind of similar to how they're doing with Codex Space Marines at the moment. So I'm sure we'll have some sort of infiltration sneaky one to represent the Alpha Legion, and some sort of Warpforged hunting pack type thing for the Iron Warriors with a bunch of demon engines and heavy weapons. If you are wanting to collect Chaos Space Marines, I definitely wouldn't wait for the Codex to come out. I'll slowly get together a core of the army and see how it adapts to the new book, though I'll probably try and keep things at least fairly balanced, maybe not just acquire excessive amounts of one thing, like say going out and picking up 3 Forge Fiends initially. They are very good in game at the moment, but it's not guaranteed to stay the same way with 40k's rules updates, and particularly with the Codex. Onto the exciting bit though, with first miniature purchases. For someone completely new to the faction, I'd probably start out with either a box of Chaos Space Marine Legionaries or Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines. Have that be your first introduction to the faction, and then build out from there in any combination of things that are either effective in game or you really like the look and feel of. Besides just a few core things to pick up, early in my priorities I'd probably have something that's quite good at dealing damage to enemy elites, so some heavy hitters for the army, and there are various flavours of them available. Things like Forge Fiends, Obliterators, Possessed, maybe Terminators and Chosen could all be interesting right now. Basically things that when they hit just about any army in the game, they're going to feel it and quite hard. Otherwise, just anything that you think looks really good, really fun or motivates you to collect the faction is generally going to be nice. Just because something isn't very good in game at the moment, or maybe it's not the first thing that most people would normally consider, doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be a reasonable purchase early on, if it is going to keep your motivation high and keep you painting and playing. Focusing on just 5 or 6 of the Chaos Space Marine kits, first we'll start out with Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines, generally one of the things to consider when you're starting just about any army in 40k. These boxes come at a bit of a discount compared with Games Workshop selling them separately. Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines is £95, €125 or 160 US dollars. This one comes with a Dark Apostle, sort of Chaos Space Marine Chaplain Preacher type units, 10 Chaos Space Marines, the standard version of the kit without the Kill Team upgrade sprue as we'll get onto, 5 Havocs with their heavy weapon, and a Mighty Hellbrute Fallen Dreadnought type thing. The discount on this one is fairly standard for Games Workshop Combat Patrols, around about 32% off buying these exact kits separately from GW, so it could be a bit of a boost to getting a few points on the table. You get around about 500 points of Chaos Space Marines out of this, and you can also use the kit to play in the actual Combat Patrol game mode as well, which I guess is another incentive. The only slightly weird thing about that is that the Combat Patrol rules do get you to arm your units with different weapons as you might want in 40k, so that can be a bit awkward. Still though, for an introduction to the army, I feel like this is a pretty reasonable set to start with. You've got the core troops for the army, a fairly iconic vehicle, and an iconic fire support unit. I would kind of rate all of these units as being sort of middling in game at the moment, as opposed to being truly standout competitive picks for the army, at least for the most part. I do quite like the Hellbrutes way that it can let other units double up with Dark Pacts, admittedly. But on the other hand, I feel like none of them are so bad that they're unplayable, particularly at a more casual level. You get a fair few heavy weapon choices in this one. I'd be tempted to pick up some las cannons to help you deal with some harder targets. When you're buying 40k kits, I'd certainly bear in mind all the other ways that you can get things other than directly from Games Workshop. They often tend to be some of the most reliable, with more stock in place than some other places at least, that things can go out, but they are generally the most expensive as well, and often around the world you'll have other hobby stores that sell exactly the same things but at a discount. A bit of a weird system if you are coming to Warhammer completely new. I've got a bunch of those linked down in the video description, including Element Games in the UK, usually around 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, Noble Knight in the US at 8% off, and Gap Games in Australia around about 20%. Not bad if paired with a Combat Patrol, which already gets you a discount. Otherwise, certainly feel free to check out the second-hand market. People often sell off their armies when they're no longer using them in 40k. You might be able to get some Chaos Space Marines at a discount, though obviously quality of the models might be variable. That is definitely one of the cheapest ways to collect an army. And of course, there's plenty of other creators out there, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers. Chaos Space Marines do tend to be a particularly popular army to make alternative warped power armor type sculpts for, and if you Google search to look at alternative Chaos Space Marine parts and sculpts, you do generally get quite a lot of interesting options come up. Otherwise though, if you are sticking to Games Workshop's plastics, another thing to be aware of is that the Chaos Space Marine Troops choice comes in two different boxes. There's the Kill Team Legionary set that you can see on the left, or the standard Chaos Space Marine box that you can see on the right. The standard Chaos Space Marine box is a little bit cheaper in the UK and US, though apparently the same price in the EU weirdly, so you may as well get the Kill Team one. Whether you want the one or the other is perhaps slightly player dependent. The Kill Team 1 gets you the chain cannon and a heavy chain axe for some fun weapon options, plus the Balefire Tome mini psyker thing. Definitely not essential, and I feel like for the extra £2.50 it's not awful. Kind of depends whether you just want a few more bodies on the table for as cheap as possible, or whether you want every single option available to the unit. For newer players, there are also another couple of kits that I'd be particularly interested at to get a whole bunch of points on the table. One of maybe the lesser publicised kits are the Warp Forged from Games Workshop. This one's a weird composite kit where it gets you 2 Obliterators and a Venom Crawler on the table. These ones are Games Workshop web store direct ones only, so you don't tend to find them at an actual discount anywhere. Despite this though, you get a medium vehicle and 2 very heavy infantry models that do cost a lot of points in game. 290 points in game for this price tag really isn't too bad by Games Workshop standards. It's almost 4 points per dollar. That actually gets you more points per money investment than the Combat Patrol, and Obliterators are quite strong in game at the moment and give you some fun fire support. I think there's a lot to be said for getting this one fairly early. Another option for getting more points on the table for slightly cheaper is Abaddon the Despoiler. He's really quite big points per dollar and costs almost the same amount as the Warp Forge. Admittedly, he's a Games Workshop character, so you don't get as much plastic for your money, but I feel like in general people do particularly like his sculpt. It is quite a nice miniature, I think. It just might be a little bit more relevant to some people if they wanted to collect, say, a Black Legion themed army, or happy to have Abaddon lead up whatever warband they're creating. Currently he's 310 points in game, which means that he's one of the best points per dollar ratios in the codex. If you're looking to make a playable 1000 or 2000 point army, then he could be a really big jump towards that. He still seems to be quite strong in game and appears in competitive lists despite this higher points cost. He could either head up a really big unit of Terminators, or some people even choose to run him solo and then use the Nurgle stratagem to keep him safe against enemy long-range firepower. All very crafty there. Otherwise, I would also mention one alternative path to creating a Chaos Space Marine army that some players might like to go down. Games Workshop's Horus Heresy Age of Darkness box set that they have for Heresy. That's £185, $310 or €240, so it's one of the most expensive box sets that they sell, but it is also one of the best discounts that they have as well. If you did pick this up and adapt it for Chaos Space Marines, you'd be getting around about 1600 points worth of models right there, almost a 2000 point army in one big jump. The miniatures in this one are the Beaky Space Marines in Mark 6 armour, which might not necessarily be your first choice for Chaos Space Marine Legionaries, but on the other hand, I feel like Chaos Marines in older marks of armour is kind of more appropriate than the Loyalists in some way. Often they haven't changed too much in the 10,000 years sequestered in the Eye of Terror. The Cataphractite Terminators can be adapted pretty nicely to be a standard Chaos Space Marine Terminator squad, and I'd run the Contemptor as a Hellbrute and the Spartan as a Land Raider if you did want to adapt to 40k rules. Admittedly, it's not a perfect fit. Some of the miniatures might be a bit bigger or smaller than the ones that you need to count them as, but it is just one way to get a perhaps surprisingly cheap Chaos Space Marine army on the go. But it definitely would be one of a certain flavour that wouldn't appeal to literally everyone. I guess one advantage of the kit as well is that you could potentially use the miniatures for the Horus Heresy game itself. If you're someone who likes to try out different game systems, then that could be one advantage, at least in theory. Talking of Heresy era models, I'd also bear in mind that Forge World has quite a lot of options that are themed around the different Chaos Space Marine legions. Again, these are more aimed at Heresy, but a whole bunch of the models work absolutely fine in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop really does have very minimal or no support for the various Chaos legions like, say, Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, or Iron Warriors in 40k. So if you wanted some themed bits from Games Workshop themselves, then this will probably be the easiest way to go. For the Forge World resin bits, they do tend to be at an even higher cost than Games Workshop's plastics, which are already seen as pretty expensive by many. So some of these might be a luxury option, but including a few of the options as perhaps a bit of a luxury pick in a greater themed force could be one way to add a lot of flavour. I'd say some of the most interesting things that they offer are Legion-specific heads and shoulder pads. A bunch of the Legion Praetors work really quite well for things like Chaos Lords or maybe Exalted Champions. Most of the legions have their own themed Terminator models that are a bit different to standard ones, and often they could be proxied fairly well for the standard Chaos Space Marine Terminator datasheet. And with Games Workshop's recent rollout of a bunch of plastic kits from Horus Heresy, there are a few things that could just directly place various vehicles in the range. Say for example the Deimos patterned Rhino and Predator tanks. Some people like them more than the current Chaos Rhino kit, some people less. Again, I feel like they can fit quite well for certain armies' themes. A more plain and less mutated or spiky look can often feel right for Iron Warriors, or perhaps for Alpha Legion or some of the other Chaos armies that tend to go in less for big spikes and mutation. Games Workshop did unfortunately move a whole bunch of Heresy era options and Dreadnoughts to Warhammer Legends recently. It means that things like the Contemptor and Leviathan Dreadnoughts do have rules, but they'll be left out of future 40k balance updates. It means that you can't play them at competitive settings or tournaments and things, which is kind of a shame to lose them from the core range. You definitely can still play with them at a casual setting though. I'd just not try and power game with them or anything like that, as if any of them wind up too strong for whatever reason, they're not going to get fixed. In any case though, I'd probably start out with some Legionaries, perhaps a Combat Patrol, maybe the Warpforged set, and perhaps a few other solid damage dealers. Once you've got a small core of the army established, you can start to expand to greater and bigger battles. A lot of players do like to give a nod to gameplay, though I would certainly bear in mind that 40k rules do tend to get rebalanced quite frequently, balance passes every quarter or so. So there is quite a lot of scope for just collecting what you think looks best and not going down too heavily on any one meta army. For the Chaos Space Marine faction, for more currently strong units, as mentioned previously, Forge Fiends and Obliterators can yield some truly terrifying firepower, particularly when they're amped up by the Dark Pacts with things like lethal hits or sustained hits, and buffed by other things like stratagems or maybe even Abaddon. For other mainline damage dealers, things like Chosen and Terminators are kind of fine for their damage and defense, again can be big units for using stratagems and things, perhaps some Possessed with the Master of Possession for fast moving melee maulers, and a Cursed Cultist with a Dark Commune are really quite a fairly cheap and efficient murderous unit, able to bully enemy light infantry, and then they have that fun rule where they get to regenerate models where you kill some of them but not all of them. A few cheapish Legionaries or Cultists can be kind of fine for holding down objectives, and plenty of the Demon Engines are fairly efficient as well. Venom Crawlers are kind of fine, Land Raiders are alright for delivering some scary melee threats into the heart of the enemy, and Predator Annihilators can be fairly scary anti-tank. For the most part, I'd say that Chaos units are in a fairly good place. I'd say more stuff is usable than isn't. There definitely are some things that are more standout than others though. You can also opt for expanding in other directions as well with Chaos Allies. Chaos Allied rules are quite liberal in current 40k. You can include anywhere between 1 and 3 Chaos Knight War Dogs, or one big Allied Chaos Knight should you like a centerpiece like that. Could be quite fun just to have something like a Rampager to throw at the enemy, or a bunch of Wardog Brigands for fire support, or Wardog Carnivores for some murderous melee. Allied Demons can be pretty helpful, both for in-game and for a bit of theme if you want. In particular, some pop-up Nurglings to score secondary objectives and screen areas of the board are really quite efficient right now, and demons have some fun lone operatives too. In general, when expanding the army, I'd have a rough idea for a 2,000 point list in mind and work towards it, playing games and adapting as you go. Finally, talking of gameplay for Chaos Space Marines, here are their core rules with the Dark Pacts and Marks of Chaos, and then we'll see one example of a strong tournament list that puts them into action. The faction's core rule is Dark Pacts. This one allows you to either get lethal hits or sustained hits each time you either shoot or fight with a Heretic Astartes unit. Lethal hits makes them extra dangerous against anything that you are going to wound on a 5+ or worse. Sustained hits is just a general nice damage buff, and the way it works is that you need to take a leadership test. If you roll less than a 6 normally, then you're going to take some mortal wounds. It's a bit of a trade-off, though I'd say it's almost always worth it on big damage dealer type units, and particularly if they're souped up with other things like character buffs or stratagems, they might just not be needed if you're almost certainly going to overkill your target anyway. Then I feel like their detachment rule is really quite fun. It allows you to give each unit in your army a Mark of Chaos, either Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slanesh, Khorne, or Undivided. Each of these interacts with the Dark Pacts in its own fun way. Tzeentch and Nurgle help these shooting ones, making one of either lethal hits or sustained hits go off on a 5+, which is pretty big, and Slanesh and Khorne do the same for the melee ones. Undivided works a bit differently, adding you some rerolls in instead. Then I feel like the Chaos Space Marine stratagems are a particularly powerful bunch. There's quite a lot of good ones, though some of my favourites are these two. There's a 1 command point one to give your unit stealth, and if it's Nurgle, it just can't be shot from greater than 12 inches away. That's enormously powerful, with suddenly keeping a unit very safe from enemy firepower. You could do that on a big block of Chosen, Possessed, or Terminators or something, or even something like a long-ranged unit like a Forge Fiend, being able to shoot at you but not be shot back. For truly terrifying damage dealing, there's a 1 command point one for an Undivided unit to just reroll all hits and wounds against their target when they make a Dark Pact. As 40k goes, that's about one of the strongest damage buffs that you can possibly get. It makes it quite tempting to make some of your biggest damage pieces into an Undivided unit, particularly nice on things like Chaos Possessed with their devastating wounds, same for Forge Fiends, and Obliterators deep striking in get big value out of it too. Finally, just to put that all together, here's just one Chaos Space Marine army list that I featured earlier on the channel. This one run by Manel Tuller, who used it to take fourth at Iberian Open, I believe a tournament in Spain. This list is headed up by Abaddon and 2 Chaos Lords who can give your units free stratagems. Abaddon does look like he's been running just completely on his own here, so either hiding behind terrain or using that Nurgle stratagem to stop him being targeted. He is still a big melee threat of his own right, and he gives out some powerful buffs for units nearby, either giving you 4+ invulnerable saves or big rerolls, maybe on the Forge Fiends here. The Chaos Lords look like they each go in a unit of Chaos Chosen. They're all Undivided and are just very tanky elite models with some good damage output, and it appears that at least some of those are being loaded into a Chaos Rhino to get them up the board and into the enemy and scrapping over midfield objectives. There's 10 Cultists with melee weapons likely to hold a home field objective, and then most of the rest of the list is just enormous firepower units, 2 massive units of 4 Obliterators, 1 Undivided and 1 Nurgle. They can deep strike in and just absolutely ruin something. And then 2 Forge Fiends with the triple Ectoplasma cannons. With so many blast weapons, they're very effective both against elite infantry and with devastating wounds punching up against vehicles. One of them's Nurgle March, which could also be useful for that stratagem, but again just buffs their shooting anyway. Finally, this list has plumped for a few allied demons, 2 units of 3 Nurglings, and then 1 unit of 3 Flamers. They're quite nice just for deep striking in or maybe infiltrating. Having pop-up units to do some grunt work like secondary objectives is really quite nice, and they can just be annoying units to get in the way or even threatening a bit of Overwatch with Flamers. Obviously just one strong way to make a powerful Chaos Space Marine army right now, but definitely showcasing a few major things that work, in particular the scary firepower at the moment. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a video breakdown of collecting Chaos Space Marines. By all means, if you think that I missed anything or you've got any other advice for newer players, please feel free to leave it down in the comments below. Always good to have newer players learn from the most seasoned generals around. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep more videos coming like this. I will be aiming to refresh each and every Start Collecting video for 10th edition in time. And if you wanted something else Chaos Space Marine to watch, I'll leave a link to my tier list video down in the video description. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page. If you have been finding this or any of the others useful, then any support there is really appreciated, keeping these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.